Hello, and welcome to Retcast Transformers Talk. If I were the person put in charge of rebooting the Transformers movies, I would be so happy and ready to do things right. What would I do, you ask? Well, let me tell you. Please note that this isn't going to go into great detail, more of just an overall big idea of what I would do. Now, the first step in this reboot would be by starting with 3 feature-length CG animated movies that details the war on Cybertron. I'd spend a great deal of time detailing Optimus Prime and Megatron's backstory, how the two separated and formed their respective factions. The story itself in the first movie would start with Prime's backstory. Then once that's fleshed out enough that people would have a complete understanding of his character, I'd then switch to Megatron's origin, which I would pull straight from the Megatron Origin comic book miniseries. With that out of the way, I'd get to the young Orion Pax meeting Megatron and Kaon and becoming good friends. There would be several discussions between the two involving Cybertronian politics, where we would begin to see Megatron's view as more of taking things by force and Pax's view as a more peaceful way to achieve change. Then we'd go to Pax and Megatron going to the High Council to give their speech. This would be the high point of the first movie. You see Pax and Megatron's interests begin to divide them, and the final divide in which Megatron would tell Pax that their friendship is over and he's going to do things his way and take it by force. I know this isn't really detailed. I just want to give an overall idea of how this would go. Also, the look of the Transformers would probably be similar to how they look in the Dreamwave War Within comics. Maybe a little bit different with Megatron's origin, since that's from an IDW comic. I don't really know what the art style would be at the time. Now, the second film would start with Cybertron in chaos, with the Decepticons running around and causing mayhem. This would start with how Bumblebee loses his voice box at the hands of Megatron. Then you'd have the scene from the War for Cybertron game where the High Council makes Orion Pax into Optimus Prime. Then B would run in and get across what happened to him. Prime would create the Autobots and tell the High Council that he's going to stop Megatron from taking over Cybertron in this violent way, but Prime would do so non-violently. Prime would eventually come to the realization that the only way to stop Megatron and the Decepticons is to take up arms and start the Civil War. Then the focus will shift to Omega Supreme. He realizes what's happening and finds Prime and vows to hunt down and kill Megatron. Then we go to the Decepticons, with Shockwave showing Megatron Dark Energon with a little explanation of how Shockwave got it. Megatron likes this, puts it in himself, and then the whole going to the core part from War for Cybertron would happen. Film would end like this. First, Omega Supreme would find Megatron because Megatron would be out in the open and wanting to be caught. This is because Megatron needs Omega Supreme to open the entrance to the core of Cybertron. Megatron would succeed and damage Omega Supreme enough to still open the gate. Megatron would access Cybertron's core and infuse his dark energon into the planet's core. End of movie 2. The third movie would begin with Megatron saying how he wants to make things even by sending a Titan of his own on the Autobots. He then activates Trypticon, transition to Jetfire flying to the Autobot HQ, which is right next to the Ark being built, to tell Prime that Omega Supreme has fallen and Megatron has implanted Dark Energon into the planet's core. This angers Prime enough that he and a bunch of the other Autobots decide to go out and purge the core of Dark Energon. On their way to the Omega Gate would be an encounter with the Combaticons, both as individuals and as Bruticus, and later an encounter with the Constructicons and maybe against the Insecticons, really showing how much Megatron wants to stop the Autobots from getting there. At some point, Shockwave would bring up his space bridge, and I'd somehow get the Dinobots in there too, like in Fall of Cybertron. turn against Shockwave, tell Prime about the space bridge, and then go to sabotage it. Prime, after purging the core and hearing this info from the Dinobots, would give the order to evacuate, but giant lasers destroying escape pods worries Prime. Once he comes back to the surface, Megatron tells Trypticon to deal with the Autobots himself, so Trypticon transforms and falls to the planet, right by where Prime is. The final act of the film goes like this. Prime, aided by Metroplex, who will be awoken by Windblade, yes, I am adding her, defeat Trypticon. Then Metroplex sacrifices himself to get the Ark off. Then Megatron, Shockwave, and Soundwave go and turn Trypticon into the Nemesis. They go and fight the Ark as they're both going through a collapsing space bridge portal, and they go through the space bridge, and the space bridge closes. Again, I know I am not going into great detail, but you get the point of it. This is where the first live-action movie would come in, but the film would start with the Ark crashing away from a populated area as to cause less trouble to the human population, and the Nemesis would crash in the ocean. The year would be modern day 2007. Then it would be a bit like the original Marvel comic where Teletran goes out and scans the vehicle forms for the Autobots. Now, the one thing I would do is that their vehicle forms would resemble the G1 vehicles, but they would have the look of the robot modes from the Bay films, kind of like that Evasion Mode Optimus Prime from Age of Extinction. Anyway, the whole point of this film would be the Decepticons want to rule over Earth and subjugate the humans to be their slaves, and the Autobots are not going to allow this to happen. There would be a fight between Prime and Megatron, and Prime would beat Megatron enough that Megatron vows to return like he always does in G1. Then the first movie would be over. I'm not sure how many humans I'd have, or even if I would have any humans, but if I did, they'd be side characters and not important to the story at all. Also, when the Ark crashes, not all the Autobots would survive it. I'm not sure, besides important characters like Prime, B, Ratchet, Sideswipe, Ironhide, and a few others, what other Autobots would still be there. This is the same for the Decepticons. Aside from Megatron, Soundwave, Seekers, and a few others, I don't know what other Decepticons there would be. The second film would start with Megatron contacting Shockwave, who is still on Cybertron, to get him to send his remaining supply of Dark Energon. Megatron would find a place to build a space bridge, and once completed, Shockwave would come through with a load of Energon for Megatron's use. He'd also have another surprise, which would be the Constructicons that he found on Cybertron. Megatron would take it and use it to make all his soldiers infused with Dark Energon and thus more powerful. We'd go to the Autobots, who have a few new members like Ultra Magnus, Blur, and a few others. Wheeljack and Ratchet are in their lab, creating the first Autobot combiner, Superion. Then the Autobots would get an alert that the Constructicons are causing mayhem in the city. This is the middle part of the film in which Prime would send out the aerial bots to face the Constructicons. Megatron and other Decepticons would show up to the fight and would use their Dark Energon, more powerful selves to kill Superion. And right at this point, Prime would show up. He'd see what happened to Megatron and would fight him and almost lose before retreating. Once back at the Ark, Prime would tell Ratchet and Wheeljack to come up with something to counter the Dark Energon. They'd come up with, let's call it synthetic Energon, like in Transformers Prime. Prime and the Autobots would use it and get a huge power boost from that. Then the film would end with a final confrontation between a power-boosted Megatron and Optimus Prime, but this time Prime would kill Megatron at the final battle. The end of the film would see Starscream become the new leader of the Decepticons on Earth. They would send Megatron and the other dead Decepticon bodies off into space. There would be a crucial after-credits scene in which Megatron's body would float to an object that looks like a planet with the dialogue, "Welcome, Megatron," in that very deep voice that Unicron has. The final live-action movie would start with the basically Unicron sequence from the 1986 G1 film. Megatron would become Galvatron, would return to Earth, and would take his leadership position back from Starscream. From there, I'd use the Autobot base attack from the G1 movie, but this time is led by Galvatron with an outcome where Prime survives but is badly damaged to where Ultra Magnus would be in charge of the Autobots while Prime is recovering. Ultimately, Magnus would fall by the hands of Galvatron, and then eventually Prime would come back. But this is the part where Galvatron realizes that Unicron is using him to get what he wants and would try to reason with Prime. This would lend to Prime's ability to use words before resorting to violence. He'd hear Galvatron out and then would agree with him that Unicron has to be dealt with. They'd go to Unicron and basically the whole end fight from the G1 movie would happen. Prime and Galvatron would get inside Unicron, and this is where Unicron would use his power to manipulate Galvatron to turn on Optimus. Prime would fend off Galvatron to give himself enough time to unleash the Matrix energy and get out of Unicron and defeat Unicron, and subsequently would have killed Galvatron once Unicron blows up. The end is where I'd have something a bit different happen. The Autobots, having defeated Unicron and Galvatron being dead, would return to Earth as heroes. Starscream would resume his role as Decepticon leader. I'd have Prime go to Starscream and convince him to end the factions and just be Cybertronians, and to live in peace and coexist with the human population. Starscream would agree with this, and everyone would be happy. Thus the film would end. So that's the basic idea of a 2-trilogy reboot for the Transformers in a cinematic way. I know it's not in great detail, but you get the overall idea of what I'm trying to say. And that's all I have to say. So if you want to add to the conversation, leave a comment below. As always, thanks for listening, and goodbye.